Hello, everybody, and welcome to a webinar of the Urban Waters Learning Network. This webinar is hosted by the Learning Network and by Groundwork USA, and we're going to get to hear from a couple of great presenters, Kate O'Brien from Groundwork USA and Carolina Martinez from the Environmental Health Coalition, about what you need to know if you encounter a brownfield as you do your urban waters work. So you are at the webinar Brownfield for Beginners, what you need to know to kickstart your Brownfield for Community Benefit project. My name is Deanna Toledo, and I am one of the coordinators for the Urban Waters Learning Network. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Learning Network, we are a peer-to-peer network of people and organizations that are working on urban waterways, restoring and revitalizing them, as well as the communities that surround them. Our goal in the Learning Network is to help you as an urban waters practitioner be more effective by providing opportunities to share experience, gain skills, and tap into technical resources that exist. In this case, you'll hear from our presenters about some of the resources they provide within the work of Brownfields redevelopment. So if you'd like more information, please turn to our website, urbanwaterslearningnetwork.org. And with that, I want to introduce our presenters. You'll first hear from Kate O'Brien. She is the Capacity Building Director at Groundwork USA. And you'll then hear from Carolina Martinez, who is a policy advocate with the Environmental Health Coalition. And Carolina has been working with Kate O'Brien and with Groundwork USA, receiving technical support for Brownfields programming. So without any further ado, let me just turn it to Kate, who will kick us off here. Kate?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Deanna, for that wonderful introduction. I'm Kate O'Brien, Director, as Deanna said, for Groundwork USA. And I wanted to take a little bit of time today to introduce Groundwork, our organization, who we are and what we do, and our technical assistance program, which is focused on brownfields and communities that are affected by brownfield sites. And then we'll also talk a little bit about equitable development as a way to sort of frame out these issues. And then a little bit later in the conversation, we'll bring in Carolina Martinez. She is a policy advocate for the Environmental Health Coalition located in National City, California, and in San Diego. And their work as an organization is to bring about community engagement and involvement in advocating for a healthier, cleaner community on the whole. And we met about a year and a half ago. Carolina's organization is a Brownfield area-wide planning grantee. So they got funding from EPA to do some brownfield planning work and reached out to us to get support for involving the community meaningfully in a brownfield to park transformation project. So I'll touch on that a little bit more later on, but wanted to provide you with some context. So Carolina is a client of ours, getting direct technical assistance support, and we're excited to sort of showcase the project that we've been working on together and how we've been working together over the past year to shed a little light on the nature of technical assistance work and what it can look like and how it may be recognizable or beneficial for your community or for your organization. So a little bit about what we'll cover. We'll talk about what is a brownfield. We'll discuss a little bit about how to get your project going or perhaps identify a project that might be worthy to take on. We'll talk about do-it-yourself phase one, also sort of, I guess we informally call those site background checks. So a site that you might consider having possibility for future development for community benefit in your neighborhood. And how to sort of steer clear of sites that might have red flags or complications due to contamination, or identify sites that are important and require some next steps. And we'll give you a little bit more information about what do those next steps look like and how you can be proactive in pursuing resources to clean up and reuse that site. And then we'll dive into a case study, as I mentioned, focused on the work that we've been doing with National City. So a little bit about our organization. Groundwork USA leads the only network of local organizations that's devoted to transforming the natural and built environment working with marginalized communities. So we're working in places that are also known as environmental justice neighborhoods. We're a national organization. We have local roots. We're in 23 communities across the country. We really work at the intersection of environment, equity, and civic engagement. So we're interested in promoting broad participation in building a more just and equitable community for all. And we'll get a little bit more into how we define equity in a moment. A little bit just about what drives our work, what drives us as practitioners and as community builders. We're focused on providing justice, providing equity, and barrier-free access to opportunity, wealth building, well-being, and thriving for everyone. So regardless of where you live or what your zip code is, everyone is entitled to a healthy community, to access to parks and open space that are high quality and beautiful, tree-lined streets, clean air, really anything outside your front door. We want everyone to feel that they have a place that they can be proud of and that their community and their families can thrive. We lead by doing, so we are what we would refer informally as a do tank as opposed to a think tank. So we get out and encourage others to come out with us, so young people, residents of all ages, local business owners, local government. Everyone's got a role to play in transforming the environment, and we really get out there and try and do hands-on work to transform that space as a way for people to activate sites, especially those that are underutilized and perhaps contaminated, and getting people to think more broadly about what kinds of possibilities they represent for the future of the community. So when really important to us is investing in people alongside investments in place. So we're not interested in making a place more beautiful and more attractive and then displacing families. Actually, we're interested in investing in people through job training programs, career ladder opportunities, job placement, youth development programs, things that would help people gain a foothold to an escalator or an opportunity, a pathway forward to prosperity and upward mobility. So a little bit about our technical assistance program. About 4 years ago, we received funding from the Environmental Protection Agency to provide technical assistance and support in the form of coaching and in sharing or creation of resources for practitioners and community members in brownfield affected communities. So our assignment from EPA was sort of twofold. One thing we would do is help communities who are interested in doing community development planning or brownfield planning specifically, planning for redevelopment, how they could do that with an eye toward implementation. So in plain speak, that is to say, how could we engage people in a very hands-on way, whether it's through a basic cleanup or a creation of a community festival or tactical urbanist, painting crosswalks in places where they're needed, perhaps a more informal basis. How can we assure that people get involved early, that they stay involved through a planning process, and then lasting imprint and lasting involvement as stewards of open spaces, as people, stakeholders who hold one another accountable to the things that were identified as priorities in the plan, and creating partnerships and coalitions to implement and get that work done over time. Trusting that it's going to take a long-term vision. So we're talking about projects that may have a planning phase anywhere from 18 months to 2 years, and that we're planning for short, medium, and long-range projects, happening, a lot of them often in parallel projects and programs that would take 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20 years to fully realize that kind of a vision. Our other assignment from EPA was to assure equity and environmental justice. And so that is perhaps a little bit more challenging. Hard to know when you've achieved equity, when things are feeling equitable. Yay, we've crossed the finish line. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But environmental justice is, right, assuring that the disproportionate burden of contamination and other negative health impacting land uses are minimized, and that robust, more healthy, more valuable land uses are happening in those communities in their place in ways that are defined by the community, so that project, for it to be beneficial, is something that's defined by and for residents and is designed and built out by and for residents in partnership with other organizations. So our technical assistance program is aimed at really long-standing intractable systemic history, engaging priority stakeholders meaningfully in project planning, in prioritizing what projects are important, ensuring that there are more of the good things happening in a neighborhood and less of the bad things, whether that's contamination or lower air quality. Those are things that we are sort of directly creating projects and programs and strategies to combat, to correct those, to disrupt those things that have been sort of longstanding for a variety of complicated reasons. Our technical assistance can take many forms. We identify and create implementation strategies, so that is defining and perhaps providing a skeleton and a roadmap for a program that would involve youth in community engagement, for instance. We might design and sequence an inclusive method for engaging an array of local people. So a lot of communities that we work with want to reach beyond the familiar faces. So there's always that core group of really committed citizens who show up at every planning board meeting. They show up at every city council meeting. They show up at every community design meeting, and they're really invested folks. However, there are a lot of people who are not involved in those processes, that there are a number of barriers and reasons why they don't participate. And you have to change your outreach and engagement methods. You have to meet people where they are and find multiple inroads, create multiple inroads, so that people have an opportunity to participate in a way that matches up with where they are in life and what they've got going on. We also do a lot of coaching of grassroots and municipal leaders in developing productive partnerships, so working with the business community, working with government, working with nonprofits, at shaping redevelopment projects and planning efforts that benefit and engage all citizens. So we seek to support practitioners who want to engage the voices that are most often marginalized from land use planning decision making, and also to provide a voice, a platform, a means for amplifying the voices who stand to lose the most if they were to be displaced, and stand to gain the most in the wave of prosperity that would come from equitable brownfield redevelopment. So I've said this term several times now. What do we mean when we say equitable development? And there's a number of bullet points here. But essentially, if you took any one of these, it would be really sort of emblematic of the greater picture that we're trying to talk about here. It's a different way of doing business. It's thinking about potential partners all the time. It's about copying people on emails, about sharing information, about being inclusive, and thinking about how can I create a meeting that has the least amount of barriers to participation, about finding common ground. So balancing a community's vision and their desire for perhaps a mixed-use redevelopment or development of a park on an old brownfield site, or creating a marketplace, right? So a lot of communities want grocery stores or banks in places that are food deserts or economic deserts. How can we balance the developer needs, the financing needs, the regulatory environment, the realities that create the conditions in which people and entities don't invest in a certain place? How can we incentivize people to come and invest in a place, or companies to come and invest? And how can we balance the need for making the dollars and cents work, making those types of projects pencil out so that they have a robust return on investment and make that sort of sound business decision, while also balancing the need for community involvement, for people who need jobs, need job training, need transit access to jobs. So it's really balancing a lot of ideas, a lot of concepts, a lot of core values, and recognizing that these are developing equitably means that there's no finish line, but also that we have responsibility to our whole citizenry to build honored and time-tested relationships over the long term, and trusting that we have the expertise and the desire and the vision within our communities to define the future and realize the future that we all want to see in them. So now we'll dive a little bit into what is a brownfield. And so I suspect if you're on this webinar, you probably have an idea about what that means, but we will dive into EPA's definition, which I will read: real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. And so the key distinction here is it could be potential presence. So it may be a site that you suspect has contamination. Often contamination is something in the soil or the groundwater you can't see, but you know based on previous land use or seeing evidence of sometimes on a vacant lot, someone's parking cars and the cars may be leaking oil over time. Any number of things that might give us sneaking suspicion that there's contamination there. EPA considers that a brownfield site. So basically it's contaminated until proven otherwise. So that's an important distinction because when EPA assigns us as a technical assistance provider to work with any brownfield effect, brownfields are everywhere. And I think that's an important take-home message here. They can be everywhere. About 20% of brownfield sites are dry cleaners, so either the dry clean facility themselves or a factory, past factory, that created the chemicals used in dry cleaning. Gas plants and underground storage tanks, landfills, junkyards, miscellaneous industries, even a residential site where a home burned and the debris was sort of dumped into the foundation and then perhaps covered up, grassed over. That's a brownfield site, right? The burned materials, there's vinyl, there's all hosts of issues and contaminants potentially that could be on those kinds of sites. So how did they come to be? Well, our industrial legacy really is a main driver of brownfield sites. So as industry and the Industrial Revolution really ramped up, there was very little known in the early years about contamination, about release of materials into the ground, knowing distinction that some contaminated material moves in groundwater, others stay within the soil and don't move. But really it's any sort of post-industrial use, land uses that created chemicals or created byproducts is part of our legacy. So I mentioned also the structure fires, that vacancy and abandonment and tax title. So land that's been sitting vacant and underutilized can have illegal dumping on it. And the things that go into that soil can be numerous and can be anywhere from heavy metals or such as lead, or something more contaminated, so polyaromatic hydrocarbons or something perhaps more complex or petroleum products. So the interesting thing about the Environmental Protection Agency and the Brownfields program is that it's very focused on assuring environmental justice and recognizing that there are no mistaking that there's a pattern to where brownfield sites are located, often in neighborhoods where there are concentrations of poor people, communities of color, and that communities have endured these types of conditions, a disproportionate burden, right, that there's more contaminated sites, there's more noxious land uses co-located in places where there are low-income concentrations of population. And so this is really an important point because the Brownfields program was created through executive order on environmental justice in 1994 by then President Bill Clinton, which assigned federal actions to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. So in the mid-1990s, federal government recognized sort of a top-down, this is an important agenda, there's a really unmistakable pattern here and we need to correct this. And EPA took that to heart and said, we recognize that contamination in land use are really important drivers in this pattern and in disrupting this pattern. And how can we clean up those sites for community benefit? And how can we promote redevelopment of those sites that are often more complicated, require a number of steps to understand what's going on. So now we wanted to zoom in a little bit more to the practical aspects of you have a brownfield site, either you know it's contaminated or you suspect that it might be contaminated. Where do I start? Where do I get going? And we completed recently have developed a flow chart to sort of highlight the number of steps involved in transforming a brownfield into a park. So if you want to turn it into a community garden or into a community center, a lot of the early steps that I will describe here will remain the same regardless of what the end use desired here. But we focus on parks because those are projects that often are very pivotal for a neighborhood in terms of turning around and transforming, improving quality of life tangibly. They're also projects that don't have an explicit return on investment. So that is to say, if I clean up a brownfield site and I build a hotel, there's a very clear return on that investment. Dollars that come out of that project that is a taxable property that's returned to the tax rolls, and that it's very, it's a promising opportunity, it's an enticing opportunity, investment for someone. A brownfield to park project, on the other hand, a park is a public good. It's often is publicly owned. That means that it's not necessarily a taxable. It's not a taxable land use. That doesn't make it any less valuable. In fact, everyone, if you talk to them, would say that parks are some of the most valuable things in a neighborhood, particularly when you live in a city. These are incredibly important projects and worth investing time and resources in because of the tangible community benefit that comes from them. So that's why we're focusing on that today, and in general, that's where we focus our work. So these are a lot of very small print, and I apologize for that. You can see more zoomed-in versions of this, and if we were to have a technical assistance engagement with your community, a tool like this might become part of the engagement project we work on together. So the first box there talks about setting a community priority, defining leadership and making sure that that's established, and securing site control. So when you first encounter this type of a brownfield site, how do you know if your organization or your government should start working on cleaning it up and getting it reused? So a really important set of questions surrounds who believes this site is important. Is there a constituency established around this site and a concept for its reuse? Who or what entity represents this constituency? Why is this site important, and who owns it? Can it be redeveloped for community benefit? So these questions alone, I rattle off these questions very quickly, but I will tell you that my own personal and professional experience answering this set of questions took about 2 years on the first brownfield site that we focused on. That came to us as a very clear community mandate from residents in a neighborhood. So visioning the site's reuse with the community. So once you start to tackle those questions, or you start to ask those questions, it's important to think about, who can lead this kind of an effort? Who has the bandwidth to lead it? Who has the knowledge to lead it? Who has community organizers that have funding in place to do some outreach, to get some more information? It's also an opportunity to shift the notion of what a public meeting can look like and feel like. So I think municipal government people often tend to think that a public meeting happens in a public building, in the library, in City Hall, perhaps in a planning department office. And what I would suggest, what I would assert, and what our practitioners have done over the years is holding informal meetings that are public meetings that the public is invited to, but they might happen in a living room. They might happen in an alleyway adjacent to the site in question. They might happen on a site itself. We had a couple of sawhorses that were created from illegally dumped trash and debris, and an old refrigerator that was turned on its side. And that became sort of a platform on which we rolled out plans and we rolled out paper, and people were able to kind of draw and take notes about the kinds of things they hoped to see for this site, what their visions were. And we encourage people to be wildly aspirational. This is the moment to really think big, think broadly, and raise the bar, raise the set of expectations about what this community can achieve, what it deserves. So rough sketches on paper, lots of notes. The more specific input or parameters, the better. And at this stage, getting this sort of information gathered, and photos to document those kinds of events allow community-based organizations to start fundraising around a project concept. So this is a mandate that we're hearing from our constituency. We're heeding this mandate and seeing it through, and to do so, we require some funding to support staff time to do further investigation to pursue this kind of vision. So it's really how it starts, very grassroots oriented in our effort. And so this can be something that is led by a small neighborhood association. This can be led by residents. This can be led by a youth program or local government. It really depends. But certainly keeping it informal and giving it a grassroots feel is a way to really make sure that people feel included or invited to participate and meet people where they are. So having something more informal, say in the alleyway next to a row of homes of people that you want to engage, those are your sort of near and dear stakeholders. Childcare might be an issue. Meeting through the dinner hour might be an issue. So thinking about all of the things that would limit someone's participation, would create a barrier, and how can we minimize those barriers to encourage participation in whatever form or fashion they're able. You might get someone who can attend for 15 minutes. You might get someone who comes with their child. How do you accommodate all of those needs and fundraise around an idea for creating minimized barriers to participation? So formalization of the project intention starts to happen with a concept design. So you start thinking more formally about who will be a project manager. Is there funding that's ample to support staff time to lead? There's a lot of behind-the-scenes work that's happening, and we'll dive into that into the second portion of this program today. That behind-the-scenes work to do the informal phase one, so the informal background check for a site. As a project becomes more formalized and fundraising starts to happen or funding becomes secured, you might be able to hire a landscape architect who would bring some more formality, more gravity to the drawings that may have just been rough sketches by neighbors on poster paper. And the landscape architect can be retained by a city or by a nonprofit. And again, it really is sort of dependent on who has the resources or who is committed to gathering resources together. So as the landscape architect would do some drawings, maybe got to sort of 25% drawing of construction documents, so that's not very far, but far enough that you start to get some flesh on the bones for what this vision could look like if it's a park or a garden. You might start to get some back of the envelope construction cost estimates. So this is a tally of, if we had a playground here, if we had play equipment, here's how much it would cost. If you wanted to plant a grove of trees, here's a per unit cost per tree. If you want larger trees, it's more money. Or if you want a parking lot here, here's some considerations for design. And so you can get kind of a rough estimate at how much you're looking at in terms of a potential target for fundraising. There are background brownfield issues that should certainly be factored in here, which lead to the next portion of this, which is about the environmental due diligence question. So this is also known as a phase one or a phase two. And a formal phase one is something that's done by an environmental engineer or an environmental engineering firm that can officially stamp plans and follow protocol defined by EPA. So it would investigate historic site uses, would do a document review. Has there been any contaminants reported on this site or spills reported on this site or sites nearby that contaminants may have migrated underground via groundwater? And this background check, this formal phase one investigation, basically would help you understand if a phase two, so a soil sample or a soil testing or groundwater testing would be warranted. So this requires, a formal phase one requires documentation and a specific process and specific protocol and reporting to EPA. Formal phase two, again, that you would have environmental engineers return to a site, do soil and groundwater sampling to confirm the nature or extent of contamination. The process is iterative, and by that I mean, so they might go out and say, okay, well, we know that there was an underground storage tank at this XYZ location on this site, so we might focus our testing efforts there. And then they might go back and say, well, those 5 sampling wells told us some stuff, but I'm thinking that some of this contaminant material may have moved, so we're going to sample a little bit further downstream or down this. So they may go back 2 or 3 times to really get a full picture of what's going on. And so this is a moment that I want to suggest that there's an informal phase one background check for a site that can happen that provides, number one, a teachable moment, an opportunity for local youth, for residents, people who want to learn more, or people who are sort of young people growing up wanting to make a difference in their community. It's an opportunity for them to go through this exercise. And then it helps all the entities size up the challenge ahead. So this can be like sort of a go or no-go point when you do an informal phase one. It's formal background check of the site. Is this a site that the community is telling us it's a mandate, the community is telling us it's important? Is this going to be a really complicated site that's going to take, a magnitude orders of, thousands of dollars, or are we talking millions of dollars here? An informal phase one can help you inform a decision enough about go or no go and investigate further or not. So just a couple of factors that involve the project scale and also inform the kind of cleanup strategy and the cost. So the end use that's desired for a site, to the extent that you know it and the extent that it can be specific, will inform the cleanup that happens or that needs to happen. So EPA has very strict requirements about the kinds of cleanups that are required to enable a new land use to happen. So if you have an industrial site that you're just going to sort of pave over or put gravel down, 18 inches of gravel and use it as a parking lot, that's a pretty low level of risk for a visitor to that site to be exposed to a potential contaminant, depending on what it is. As you increase use of a site, so increase in the intensity, so the amount of time that would be spent on a site by a person, by a visitor, the more intensive that is. So if you're talking about, a grocery store or a home or a school or a park where vulnerable populations might be living 24/7, that's going to be a more extensive, more cost-intensive cleanup. So that's a very loose, sort of high-level generalization, but that generally holds true. And generally, we're talking about 4 different types of remedial action. So one is capping in place. That is where you would put sort of 18 inches to 3 feet of topsoil or some sort of fill over the material. And sometimes that involves a vault, so paving over the top that is not penetrated, so capping in place. A partial cap and select soil removal, so an engineering firm might identify hotspots where there's high concentrations of a contaminant of concern. You might scoop those out, take them to a regulated facility, and bring in clean fill. And then another part of the site, a portion may be kept. Complete soil removal, as it sounds, you space the whole thing out and bring in clean soil. And then phytoremediation or mycoremediation, which is sort of in a pilot phase, is planting certain beneficial plants that would uptake contaminants of concern. So lead may be uptaken by, say, mustard greens, for instance, or mycoremediation, so using fungus to essentially eat contamination. Those are, as I said, are more pilots in nature, and there's a lot more that needs to be learned, a lot of study happening about that kind of a remedial action, but worth mentioning at any rate. So a formal phase one, just very briefly, is called an ESA, Environmental Site Assessment. We've covered that it discusses historic land issues, past uses of the site, and would report on conditions that are indicative of environmental contamination. And an official phase one report is done by a qualified environmental professional, typically an environmental engineer. And it's done as part of due diligence. So before you buy a piece of property, it would help protect an innocent purchaser who did not create the contamination, provides documentation that indeed they did not cause the contamination but want to do the right thing by cleaning it up, and provides liability protection as well. An informal phase one may involve something just a little bit more what would feel doable. So searching online databases, so government databases, an online search with the state DEP, reviewing historical or topo maps, so getting a sense of the physical setting. If there's a high point on the site, you can generally assume that contaminants that are living in groundwater or with hosts in groundwater would move downhill or downstream. You can look for those topo maps in the state library, looking in old historical atlases, industrial directories. Sanborn Maps are also interesting. We can talk a little bit more about those in a minute. And also evaluate property maps and photos and records. So looking at historical aerial photographs, looking at records in the fire department or the planning department, building permits and whatnot. So just an example of some visuals to indicate what you would be looking at if you were doing a search in a state database. You might see a number of sites that have been reported where their hazardous waste was either released or cleaned up, or some sort of a permit was given, or a leaking underground storage tank was reported. But it's important to remember that these are things that have been reported. So if things have happened but nobody's reported it, or no one is aware that that sort of a breach has occurred, then those wouldn't necessarily show up in a state database. Sanborn Maps are fire insurance maps that were developed for the insurance industry. These are really cool maps that were started in the 1800s that through present day you can look, many of them have now been digitized, but you can go to a library or a planning department or city hall often and look at properties as they changed over time. So one site you may see an industrial use, later on you may see a train track had been laid down to access the site. That train track may have been removed at a later time. If there's an underground storage tank, you might find indication of that at some point. So it just helps to understand if there have been structures on the site. Perhaps there's a foundation that you can see. There may be a note about what was on that site, what kind of material was stored there. And it helps understand fire risk for insurance companies many, many years ago. So things that were flammable are probably things that are potential contaminants of concern in modern times. Just some examples of Topo maps. I'm going to kind of skim through these in the interest of time, but these are property maps that you can just start to get a sense again through history. You can look at what kind of land uses were on a site, where building footprints may have existed, where underground storage tanks may have been located. Here's aerial maps. You can see the difference in land use right along the same stretch of a river's bend, the difference between 1940 and 1986. In 1940, that red sort of squarish area looked pretty undeveloped, and then in 1986, you can see that a portion of it, there's been something built upon it. Perhaps there's maybe a parking lot or some sort of a concrete pad. So it just gives you an indication of something changed in terms of the land use there. Just an example of database records and what you might find in a search. There's industrial directories. So each state has industrial directories that indicated what kinds of companies and operations were located where. It's incredible the amount of information that was recorded a long time ago that is still are relevant in background searches today. So doing a site reconnaissance now, I want to say very clearly that if you don't have site control, if you don't have permission to do a site visit, you may be considered trespassing, and so I don't want to suggest that you just go out and trace around a site and look for leaky pipes or look for underground storage tanks or evidence of telltale signs. But assuming that you do have site control invitation and permission to visit a site, then documenting the physical features and comparing what you've seen on historical maps with what may be seen in present time could be helpful. And then I'll just skim through these very quickly. Other telltale signs that there may be environmental contaminants of concern. Underground monitoring wells, seeing bins or storage tanks that are standing on a site. Transformers that may indicate some PCBs, sheen on a water surface. These are, I guess, pretty classic examples. Monitoring wells may illustrate that testing was done at some point or is actively being monitored over time now. Shadows of oil tanks or other oil traps or other things in the floor or on walls. So I know that was incredibly fast and quick, but Deanna, if you might bring up those other survey questions. Just wanted to get a sense of if you've learned anything new today, and no hard feelings. Understand that this is all very basic, cursory information, but provides a jumping off point. One thing that you've learned today that you can take back to your project. I'll give you a moment to type in your answer here. I'll take a look. These projects seem like huge undertakings. There is a question about what type of capacity does an NGO need to successfully lead such a project. what do you suggest that smaller NGOs have 1 or 2 staff people and a budget smaller than $200,000 to address local brownfield issues? So that is a really huge question. I would say that short answer is you bite off as much as you can chew, and you don't really know that until you start to dive in and fundraise for it. So obviously a budget is going to dictate how much you can or cannot take on. And Carolina, maybe in your remarks you can talk about that a little bit in terms of how your organization decided how much or how little to work on a project. To talk more about this as well further on, Brad, later if you want to have a conversation. There's some other things I can think about to help you kind of ascertain what you think you can work on and what other resources might exist in your community to help support your work. So fiber remediation is a pilot project. Thank you so much for all of your answers that you've answered here. Community engagement early on is an overlooked but important task. You all are doing some really active listening. Thank you so much. Deanna, in the interest of time, happy to move on here. Thank you so much for your answers. It's helpful for me to know how to tailor my remarks moving forward. I wanted to give Carolina a chance to introduce herself and her organization and talk a little bit about the project that we started working on together. So Carolina, do you and Erin want to introduce yourselves really quickly?
Hi everyone, my name is Carolina and I'm a policy advocate at Environmental Health Coalition.
Hi everyone, I'm Erin and I'm also a policy advocate at the Environmental Health Coalition.
All right, thank you ladies. So we wanted to have a chance to sort of debrief the kinds of work that Carolina and I have been working on for, let's see, I'm trying to remember when your letter of interest first came in. I think it was like around June 2014. So almost 2 years since we first met one another digitally over email, and then had the good fortune of meeting each other in person later that fall. And the Environmental Health Coalition had received a grant from the EPA Brownfields program to do an area-wide planning process. And without getting into too much detail, if you're not familiar with the area-wide planning program at EPA, it's a relatively new grant. They've had, I think, 3 rounds, and there's a current competitive round for that grant open right now. It's $200,000 for a 2-year planning project, and essentially you identify a corridor or a neighborhood or a sector of your community that has a concentration of brownfield sites, and you identify a set of those sites that would be catalytic if they were cleaned up and transformed equitably for community benefit of some sort, and community benefit as the community would define it. How might that create a positive domino effect for your community? So it might promote reinvestment, it might promote new development, it might promote better quality of life, better public health outcomes, however your community decides to define it. It's a planning process that enables you to retain consultants to do market analysis, to do further environmental investigation, to really pull together a steering committee of stakeholders in the community who would identify goals and opportunities and identify projects and opportunities for implementation. So how might we activate these kinds of sites knowing just the things that I've been talking about for the last 20 or 30 minutes, knowing that these kinds of projects can take a long time to understand and a long time to finance and a long time to see through to completion, that while you're waiting, you're just waiting around for investment to happen, people want to get active. People are in communities that have long been marginalized. People are sort of planning fatigue is a very real thing. And so how can we activate people and getting them involved in transforming their community in the current climate is very important. Quick question, what's the name of the EPA program Kate's now describing? That's the EPA Brownfields Area-Wide Planning, or AWP program. So if you just Google EPA Area-Wide Planning, fact sheet will come up. So Carolina, do you want to describe your area-wide planning project a little bit and perhaps how it led you to seek out the technical assistance that we provide at Groundwork USA?
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Perfect. So we had been working on addressing land use and compatibility issues in the Old Town area because we have a lot of auto body shops next to homes and the elementary school. And in that process, we were able to identify a policy that will phase out those industries. And we wanted to advance a mechanism to receive those industries into a really heavy industrial area. So, so thinking also how do we clean up and green up those industries and retain them in the appropriate area in our community. And so we came up with the idea of a green industrial auto park that would house those industries that are phasing out of the residential area. The project had been, there was a feasibility study that was done back in 2008 when in California we still had redevelopment funding, and that was the idea to provide funding for that project. But redevelopment was dissolved, and so we needed to figure out how do we make this project a reality in our current financial reality. And so we applied for the area-wide planning grant to plan for the Green Industrial Park. The grant provided an opportunity to conduct a feasibility analysis and kind of put together an idea of how much it would cost to develop this Green Industrial Park. And so the project was carried out, a report came out of it, and the cost of the project right now was estimated at $6 million. So that's a lot. And at this point, the project is kind of on hold, but the area-wide planning grant also provided technical assistance for the park, but also for other areas. And so, because it's area-wide. So I think it's important to go back to the fact that it is within environmental justice communities that you find a lot of brownfields. So we wanted to do a redevelopment of a brownfield site and turn it into a green industrial auto park. And even though that project is right now on hold because of cost, we're looking at other brownfield sites and collaborating with Groundworks USA on another brownfield site to take advantage of that opportunity and advance other projects that now have the feasibility to move forward.
Yes, great. So, and so Carolina came to us in June of 2014 when her area-wide planning process was wrapping up or had just wrapped up. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the charge that EPA assigned to Groundwork USA was support area-wide planning grantees with, in addition to assuring environmental justice and equitable development, which are EPA Brownfield program's overarching goals, assist communities, support communities with managing the transition from planning to implementation. And so what the Environmental Health Coalition was saying was, it came out that it was a very high priority to pursue this green industrial park and to pursue a project for community benefit that National City, the reality on the ground in National City is that it's highly industrial or formerly industrial. There are a ton of brownfield sites. There's a lot of industrial uses, that there's poor air quality, that there are significant environmental justice burdens, proportionate burden impacts that are negative from these industrial uses and from these brownfield sites on minority populations, on low-income communities, on places where there's concentrated poverty. And Environmental Health Coalition, in pursuit of its mission, wanted to create a positive impact given those conditions. And so we thought that as a technical assistance provider, that we could help test, essentially test two implementation scenarios. And one was this Green Industrial Park project. And so there was there was an outline, there was a report that was done about the Green Industrial Park, what the needs were, what the opportunities were, but cost was a significant factor. And so Carolina mentioned that project is on hold, and what we clarified through our technical assistance engagement was that more information was required about any site that this green industrial park would be located on, because brownfield conditions are extensive throughout the community, and that it would require some funding to do that kind of testing. And so we got some quotes for a site that they had in mind, and learned that it would cost, from $10,000 to $20,000 to do a formal phase 2 investigation, to do a risk assessment, to understand what constraints might exist on a brownfield site that would prevent green industrial park vision from being born on the city, an opportunity to look at all the data, look at the information and the cost, and say go or pause. And so what they decided was, through this process where we got some more information and sort of talked through it and thought partnered together, okay, maybe this isn't the site. $6 million, it's going to be $20,000 just out the door to know if we should, to get more information specific about the contamination. Maybe this isn't the time. Maybe we should set our sights elsewhere. And that was a really important moment. Sometimes saying no and understanding the limitations is difficult. And Carolina, I wonder if you might talk about how you communicated that back to the constituency, to the residents and the stakeholders who really, really excited about the green industrial park. Like how did that conversation go, and how did you make it right to kind of pursue the other project that we're still working on today?
Yeah, so what happens in our process is that the community has or is involved through the whole process of the feasibility study of the industrial park. The community was engaged. And so there were a lot of report back, and we visited auto body shops, conducted a tour, and kind of everyone, the idea was that everyone would become a form of an expert in the topic. And so by the time came out, it wasn't a surprise that the price tag was on the high end. And so the conversation was leading up to that. I think the most valuable component of this project was that the community got to tour the auto body shops. Even though the residents live next to the auto body shops, they had never been inside an auto body shop or understand how they operate, and also building a relationship with the business owners. So understanding the perspective of the business owners and developing relationships around that. So going back to the question, by the time the outcome of the report was provided, it wasn't a surprise to the residents, and I think it also is in line with what has happened here in Old Town National City, that a lot of our projects have a lot of challenges, and so it's not new to the residents that this has a high price tag and that it may take some time. And it's comparable to the housing project that is now actually being constructed, that is costing $60 million, that took 10 years to envision and make happen. And so the residents, because they're also involved in that, they kind of know that all these projects take a very long time and a lot of commitment. And sometimes they get put on hold, but they come back at the moment when there's a new program at the state level that is providing funding for industries to clean up and green up, which is something that is not just happening in Old Town National City. So it is likely that we'll see in the near future funding that could be provided for this type of programs or development that we want to see in our communities. So the residents know that this is something that may happen. So it's kind of transferring energy also to other projects and other areas where we see it being feasible.
Mm-hmm. And as the technical assistance provider, it was it's incredibly admirable and exciting. I felt honored to be part of that process that residents had been involved in for so long. I mean, those people are never going to let that vision die, right? That's something that people were living and breathing and invested in for a number of years, from touring those auto body shops and understanding the ins and outs of how those businesses operate and what they needed to be successful. And those kind of auto body shops, making them relocate to and doing their business differently, like greening their practices, there's a price tag associated with that as well. And so no one was interested in like squashing those, small businesses, those mom and pop shops. Didn't want to, inhibit anyone's livelihood, but also really wanted to kind of make, balance the priority of, economic sovereignty and access to opportunities and wealth building, and clean air, right? Air quality for young people in a place where asthma rates are pretty high and particulate matter is a pretty significant issue in that community. So it doesn't have to be an either-or proposition, but it does mean sometimes you've got to be persistent and wait or stay busy doing other things, which sort of brings me to the next piece of our engagement. And Catalina, you can talk a little bit about this slide and where it came from, but it's illustrating the project of Paradise Creek National City TOD project, which is where we have focused our direct technical assistance efforts now. Catalina, do you want to describe that project a little bit and how EHC got involved? And then we can talk a little bit about the focus of our engagement together.
Yes. So let me just close the loop on the industrial park. So when we were working with Groundworks USA, we had all the intention to have a project to be related to the industrial park. And so when I placed my request for technical assistance, I asked for support in building the relationship with the port, the local port, because we were hoping that the relationship with the port would then trigger some funding for this project because we're also a port of entry. But that wasn't necessarily the project that was going to move at the time, and so that's when we started looking. So I remember when Kate exactly asked me, well, are there any other brownfield sites? Are there any other projects that you're working on that seem more feasible at this time? And so that's when we started talking about open space in the Old Town area. And so to backtrack a little bit on the history of the work that we've been doing in the Old Town National City, in 2005, we met with the community and the residents kind of identify the priorities they wanted to see in their community. And one of the priorities was to address the land use incompatibility. But because environmental justice is very comprehensive, they also identify the need for affordable housing. And they said, we need the industries out into a heavy industrial area. We need affordable housing. And so since then, EHC, together with the residents, have been working on advocating for this project, for the affordable housing, for the phase out of industrial uses, for the improvement of streets and pedestrian safety, and all these other components that have to do with quality of life, a healthy lifestyle in your community, seeing that being expressed through the built environment. And so fast forward to 2010, this vision passes, and it's approved by the council, and it includes the affordable housing project, the phasing out of industries. And so since 2010, we've been working on implementing this project. So remember when I mentioned that California, we had redevelopment funding. So that funding would provide funding for the housing. Well, redevelopment was dissolved while this housing project was being included into that funding source. So it became a process to claim that the project had already been committed to. And luckily, this is actually one of the last redevelopment projects. So it had some funding, but then it had some gap funding. And so we were, seeking out opportunities, identifying mechanisms to put all the funding for this project, this $60 million project. The project also includes a park, a public park, and you'll see it in the drawing. It's on the left side of the site plan, and you see the housing on the right side, and in the middle you see Paradise Creek. So this is also a transit-oriented development. It's being built on top of a brownfield site. And just to go back to where we started working with Groundworks USA, Kate asked, well, what are other projects that you're working on? And this is another project that we're working on, the housing project. And the park in this, and you see it in the park is being built on top of a brownfield site, and it's part of the $60 million price tag. And it's and the community has been very, very engaged in the housing component by, determining the design preferences. We were also very engaged in the lease-up process, making sure how it's promoted. We were actually able to pass a policy that prioritizes local community to move into the housing, and so as a way of addressing the displacement issue. But the park component has been kind of on the weaker end. And so what we've been working a lot with Groundworks USA is kind of articulating how do we see the community engage in the design for the park. We at Environmental Health Coalition have not been so focused on open space as much as we're doing now, because there's actually other two projects in our communities that are also to open space. And so it's been really helpful to work with Groundworks USA to kind of push the conversation around the park and seeing how we could integrate the community in the design of this park so that it really represents the community interest, but also with the help of Groundworks USA, we identify that it's really important to engage them in the maintenance plan so that the community continues to be engaged in the park and it enjoys it and also helps to take care of it.
Yeah, so that was a big part of the conversation that we had most recently. So the city received the funding from the state, right, the cap and trade funds to finance the project. And the way that I understood it was, and correct me, Catalina, if I'm wrong, was that there's 3 phases to this project. And the first one was, let's build the affordable housing. The second piece is the transit-oriented aspect of it, so building the infrastructure to allow the transit access to and from the site so that people could sort of, in the theory, live and work nearby or live near a transit line where they could transport themselves to their jobs. And then the third phase was this public park / community garden space, so the public, the recreational component of it. And that the funding for that had been set aside in this budget, but that it was sort of the end in a seemingly linear process as it was planned. When I heard about this project, I was a little bit worried, like, well, what if things run, over, cost overruns are a real thing, and construction management is tough. There's always, it requires extreme vigilance to manage these kinds of projects so cost overruns don't happen, and if they do, is that money set aside? Is it protected so that the park would be there in perpetuity? And so based on my own, previous experience, getting the residents involved very early on is not just a way to sort of ensure that the park or the end use is designed according to the specifications, the needs of the people in the community or desires, right? So that if everyone wants a tot lot and it turns out to be playground equipment for 5 to 12-year-olds, that's a mismatch, right? So, or if people wanted a park with water access, but there's a community garden there, that's a mismatch. So how do we, make this place feel responsive to the needs and the whims of people in the community, but also that it's an insurance policy of sorts to have residents involved from the very beginning to hold the collective community accountable to this, right, so that that money that was set aside will remain, that the vision for this park, that, having a new home is lovely, having an affordable quality, high-quality home with transit access is lovely, but part of what makes urban living great is when you've got a beautiful park or open space or tree-lined area where you can, send your child to play safely. That's dedicated, safe place to play or do programming and collect as a community. So, so it was really important. And then also, that we're creating stewards, right? That in general, and I've seen this in my work across the country, that cities are increasingly unable to care for the public open spaces, right? So the city park systems that exist in this country are underfunded, are undermaintained, and there's a lot of room for that, a lot of systemically for that as our communities and our demographics shift. And so the onus is on the public to pick up the tab, to do some of that maintenance. So when I say P3 here on this left part of the slide, the public-private partnership is really what's going to be required in the 21st century to care for our open spaces. And in places where the trash cans on a park site can't get emptied frequently enough, or there's deferred maintenance for trees or watering systems going down. How do you care for those places? And then how do you create new parks on former brownfield sites? Like if cities are in the business of getting rid of their vacant land and selling it off and bringing it back to productive reuse on the tax rolls, why would a city take on a brownfield site and turn it into a park? Besides obvious community benefits, but that doesn't necessarily pay for itself. So it's an important thing to have a grassroots constituency of people involved in the visioning and in the planning and implementation over time. So that was something we were very interested in supporting and making sure that EHC felt led what they needed to help the community advocate, help their constituency advocate for their involvement, so that it wasn't just sort of checking the boxes like, yep, well, the community said they wanted a park, we're going to do it, but that they were substantively involved in that design. And Cato, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that maintenance planning and what we meant when we said maintenance planning and how that helped us turn the corner with the city.
So, it was really interesting because even though we had been working with the city to develop the housing and we've been working with the city for a very long time, and well, I was ready to bring up the conversation on community engagement in the planning and design of the park. And so I brought up the conversation and also the fact that Groundworks USA was going to be providing us with technical assistance. And I think it was kind of surprising, but not. We're kind of used to it in a way. The city was not super open for us to be involved with that at that point. The reaction was on the negative end, and we weren't surprised, but also we were trying to think of, all right, so well, how do we push this conversation a little bit more?